Yeah, okay. Well, I usually work with everyday objects, set them up in still lives to represent some sort of a narrative. The objects become a metaphor for the narrative. I've been working a lot with objects that are being tied with strings, as you can see here, and as in the case of this print, being pulled apart to some extent from different directions by the pins. I consider this some sort of a punishment for something this object has done. And so when I was told that it had to fit to some extent the idea of 16, I thought the first immediately came to my mind is punishment for 16 sins, right? As if this object was getting punished for 16 bad things it had done.
I love that.
And its punishment is, I guess, to some extent being dismembered by the pins, as being pulled apart. But, so that is in a sense the explanation of you know, the title of the print and also how it came to fit into the 16th subject.
And what exactly the object that's being punished? What is that?
Yeah, I actually didn't know for the longest time what it was. It was an interesting shape that I found in my garage. You know, it's a metal object. And somebody recently told me it was a gasket, which is part of a car engine, something like that. But I don't know what it's used for. A lot of the objects that I use in my work, sometimes I don't know what they are. Sometimes I find them in the street when I'm going for a walk and I pick something up that looks interesting, and it could be a plastic toy that some kid dropped from a stroller, or a piece of a card or something that is just there, and I have it in my studio often for months, and one day I'll think, oh, this is exactly what I need for this image. So that's it. So a lot of the times I pick the objects for formal reasons, because I want something either you know, made of plastic or metal or a certain color or a certain shape, because I'm working intuitively towards a certain mood or a certain story. Sometimes they are objects that everybody will recognize, maybe not in this case, but you know, there are other things like the ball or a spool that anybody will recognize. And sometimes I will use those objects for the everyday connotation that they have, as well as for the other meaning that they will have in the new setup. Well, I find that most of my narratives, a lot of my work ends up being political, if you want, to some extent, in a broader sense of political, not just, you know, government, just from a government point of view, but in a broader political context. And there is a lot of times the theme of religion in a lot of my work. I seem to always be revisiting the themes of authority, submission, exploitation, and those kind of themes seem to be recurrent in my work. And I say seem to be because I don't look for the stories in a very I don't go out and say, well, I'm going to make a painting about a very specific certain event. I see sometimes a composition or a certain object that suggests something to me, and then I start building the narrative around it. And then kind of halfway, and sometimes towards the end, I think, oh, this painting is about X, you know, whatever X is. And I often seem to be visiting that subject. And I'm not sure whether it is that I'm originally from Argentina, and there is a lot of very troublesome events, historical events, political events in my country, that I may have a certain awareness for these things, or it may be present in me for that reason. Yeah, I was born in Argentina, and I did my first college degree there. I have a bachelor's in English as a second language, so I was trained to teach English as a second language in high schools, and but then I wanted to go to some country where I would practice English, and and just for the experience. So I ended up coming to the U.S. to Penn State University, where I got an assistantship to do a master's in adult education. So I did that, and I ended up staying in the U.S. because I married another student that I met there. And I was always interested in art. I was always drawing when I was a kid. So at a point where I couldn't work here because I was still in a student visa, and but I was staying at home with my first child, I started taking art classes, and that immediately took over everything else.
Yeah.
And when we moved to Austin, I started studying art in a full-time way. I went back to school and studied studio art at the University of Texas at Austin. So that's my educational background. That's with. Yeah, my husband is Dutch, and we lived in Pennsylvania. He had a job there, and I was staying pretty much at home with the kids. Although I did do some teaching at community college. I was teaching Spanish, but he wanted to live where the sun shines. He wanted to move to a place where it was warmer, and since all his life he had been in colder climates, and got a job offer in Austin, and we came. And we've been very well. I did start off with watercolor when I started taking art classes. I started off with watercolor, and then pastels. Then when I started studying at UT, I pretty much moved into oil painting, but I did take 2 intaglio classes at UT. So I did have some experience in printmaking, although it's a completely different process, on the metal plates and everything. I found it very intriguing, very interesting. But intaglio, I found that most of the time you're doing black and white, and what I liked about color is the ease with which you can use color. So I decided that I would stay with painting most of the time, although I like doing a bit of other things. But because I was
You got something out there.
yeah, because I was studying art when I already had children and had limited time, I ended up focusing on painting 100% of the time. So I felt that I needed to develop my skills, and so I needed to focus on one thing. So when the opportunity came to do this residency, I thought it was great to go back to experimenting with other media. And it was hard for me to make the transition between painting to the silk screen, because in painting you can permanently correct, go back and forth, and you work with everything at the same time. And when you're making prints like this, you put something down and it's there for eternity. Kind of, right? You can't scrape it off, or you can't go over it, but it's still there. So I found that was very challenging. The other difference that because of the kind of work that I do in painting, I work primarily with light and space. Depth, is very important in my work, as well as light and in the environment, the mood that the light creates, and that I find it much harder to translate to this medium. The subtleties of light, for example, right?
Yeah.
So when I prepared for this project, I made an acrylic painting, trying to think of flat layers of color, trying to move away from the way I was working in my oil painting all the time. So I produced a painting that was quite close to this, to help me think in other ways and not try to force what I do in painting onto this medium. I do use a lot of warm colors when I paint. I have used this palette quite a bit of the ochres and blues together. But it's not I don't necessarily work within one palette all the time. It seems to go through periods. There have been periods of time when I worked in a very monochromatic way, still within the ochres, but very monochromatic. And there are other times where I have been less monochromatic and use more contrasting colors within the same painting. But this does relate a lot to what I normally do in my paintings. As a lot of people, before I started studying art, I enjoyed the Impressionist paintings. A lot of people do. As I started studying art, I started getting interested in work that is probably less well known. But particularly a few years ago, when I started working with objects this way, I had started looking a lot at Chinese painting, ancient Chinese painting, the long silk screens that are these formats that are long and narrow, and I haven't used it in this because, well, you have a standard size that you're using for this project, but I often work with long, narrow formats that remind you of those scroll paintings, and I like these. I like these faraway views of a landscape that these Chinese paintings have. Their use of perspective that is different from, Renaissance perspective. The fact that there is often some sort of a narrative going on. Somebody's army walking, to some village or something going on. I also another element that. Or another artist that was very influential for me is Bosch. Again, you don't see that so much in this image because this image it's an indoor image to some extent. It's some sort of a room, but a lot of my bigger work has to do with landscape views, and the fact that Bosch has these fantastic landscapes with all these sorts of monsters and things, and again a narrative, some action going on. And a lot of my larger work that looks like a landscape has a bit of that feel. A lot of people tend to see it as surreal, although the work is 100% real because they are still lives, but it is the mood of the light and the color and everything that kind of, I find, relates it to Bosch's work. And then Tiepolo has these amazing skies, religious paintings, and I have used that as well in my work. Those are the main three influences that I can cite that are directly related to my work. And there is a lot of other work that I like. That I hope that they look at the work not in a literal way, but that they are able to see beyond the literal objects or the literal interpretation of the work, and hope that they can make up their minds for themselves as to what the work means.